Okay, God bless you. Welcome back, class. We are now going to begin part two of our class today, of our lecture. And what we're going to be doing is we're just going to continue to be looking at and covering some of these terms, some of these events that we find in the study of eschatology. We're going to continue to look at some of the eschatological terms, definitions. And if you recall, the reason why we're doing this is because really we want to lay a foundation of what we're going to be covering in the book of Daniel. Daniel is going to mention, he's going to talk, he's going to describe many of these events. And so before we jump into a study of Daniel, I believe it's important that we familiarize ourselves with these terms and that we kind of have a good grasp and a good understanding of what exactly they are, what exactly they mean, what is going on with them, in order that when we go to Daniel and when we study, especially the prophetic sections of his writings, we're not confused, we're not lost at what exactly he's saying. And so let's just continue from where we left off in our notes from the first part of our lecture. And now notice with me in number 4 there in your outline, the fourth term or the fourth event that we want to talk about is the tribulation period. Now notice with me, this term is a reference to a future 7-year period of time when God is going to pour out his wrath, when God is going to pour out his judgment upon the earth. It's really a future period of time when God is going to judge a Christ rejecting world. And like I mentioned, this event will last for 7 years. And like I said in the first half of class, I personally believe, it is my personal opinion and understanding from Scripture that this event will take place at some point after the rapture of the church, and it will come to a conclusion at the second coming of Christ. And so first, in my understanding of end times events, eschatology, first, Jesus will come for his church and take us to heaven. Then at some point after that event, at some point after the rapture, and we don't really know exactly when after, it could be right after, it could be an extended period of time, but I just personally believe that after the rapture, there will be a period of 7 years here on the earth where God will judge, God will pour out his wrath. We find a detailed description of those judgments in the book of Revelation 6 through 18. In total, John records and describes 21 judgments, and like all of God's attributes and like all of God's works, his judgment will also be perfect. And so 21 judgments, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls. And then that time period will come to a conclusion with the second coming of Christ. Now, as we get into our study of Daniel and as we study his writings, most definitely we'll talk more about this event. Daniel spoke about this time of judgment. Actually, it's commonly referred to as the 70th week of Daniel. That's taken from Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. And it's actually Daniel who tells us that this 70th week, this 7-year period of time, will actually begin when the Antichrist, this world leader, as we're going to see in a moment, who's going to come on the scene in the future, he will sign a pact, he will sign a treaty, he will make some type of accord, some type of agreement with the people of Israel. And when that covenant is made, many believe that is really the beginning of the tribulation period, and there will be a 7-year period of time which will conclude with the return of Christ. And so we'll talk more about this time period. We'll talk more about what Daniel tells us, what the prophets tell us, and especially what John describes to us in the revelation of Jesus Christ. And so the tribulation period. Let's continue. Notice fifth, now we come to the Antichrist. The Antichrist. Now this term, really it's more of a title, is a reference to a world leader that is going to come on the scene in the future during the tribulation period. And eventually, according to Daniel and according to John in his revelation, he's going to take full control of the world. He will at some point obtain world domination, and he will be really the last world empire who will dominate before the return of Christ. Now in the future, like the tribulation period, we're going to talk more in depth about this world leader. We're going to talk more in depth about the Antichrist, because as we're going to see in his writings, interestingly, Daniel actually speaks extensively concerning the Antichrist. But Daniel doesn't refer to him as the Antichrist, but Daniel actually refers to him as the little horn. And it's actually Daniel, as I mentioned, who shares with us that at some point this little horn, this Antichrist, is going to make a covenant with the nation of Israel. Daniel tells us he's going to rise to power. He's going to rebel and blaspheme against God. He's going to persecute the people of God. Daniel also tells us that the Antichrist is going to abominate and desecrate the temple of God, and ultimately the Antichrist is going to be destroyed by the hands of God. He's going to be crushed with the coming of the Son of Man, the Messiah, the Lord Jesus Christ. And so Daniel really paints for us a detailed picture of this coming world leader, and really he describes to us his kingdom and the short season where he will be in control and where he will have world domination. But Daniel also describes to us his destruction, his end, which will come at the hands of God. Daniel refers to him, like I said, as the little horn. John refers to him as the beast. Paul refers to him as the lawless one, but we commonly know him as the Antichrist. And so a future world leader who will come on the scene, in my opinion, at the beginning of the tribulation, and pretty much by the midpoint of the tribulation, he is going to obtain world power, and he will be the final world leader, the final kingdom before God establishes his kingdom on the earth. Now notice 6, let us continue, the abomination of desolation. Now this term, this event is very, very important. Daniel speaks extensively on it. And so it's important that we kind of get a good grasp of what it is, what it's a reference to, in order that when we get there to Daniel chapter 8 and Daniel chapter 9 and Daniel chapter 11, we're not going to be confused at what Daniel is saying. So I want to kind of give you the big picture right now, just a little introduction, and then we'll eventually get into the details. But notice with me in your notes, this term is a reference to two events. And what we mean by that is that this event has what we call a double fulfillment. And so it has been fulfilled to a certain degree already in the past, and one day it will be fulfilled fully in the future. And so that's the idea behind double fulfillment, that Daniel prophesied about this event, and it was an event that was fulfilled in the past, in the history of Israel, but it was a picture, it was a type of something bigger, of something greater that would come in the future. And so there's a double fulfillment here, and I want to explain to you what I mean. And like I said, we'll talk more about this in the future. First, it's a reference to an event that took place in Israel, in the land of Israel, approximately 200 years before Christ. And this event revolved around a Syrian king by the name of Antiochus IV. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Antiochus Epiphanes IV in the future. But really all you have to know for right now is that approximately around the year 165 BC, before Christ, Antiochus IV, he literally attacked Jerusalem and really took control of the city. And when he took control of the city, we're told that he entered the temple there in Jerusalem, which would have been the second temple. And there in the temple, he sacrificed a pig on the altar, desecrated the temple, the sanctuary. And then after sacrificing a pig, he established his image to his false god in the sanctuary. And so Antiochus IV, he really desecrated and abominated the temple there in Jerusalem, approximately 165 BC, approximately 167, I believe, to 164. And so there we find an abomination of desolation. And really that event produced what we know as the Maccabean revolt. And it's described to us in the book of Maccabees. But as we're going to see in a very detailed manner, Daniel, writing in the 6th century BC, writing about approximately 400 years before, Daniel prophesied about this event. Daniel made reference to this abomination of desolation that would come by the hands of Antiochus IV. And so we see there's one fulfillment to this event. It has already taken place. It has been fulfilled in the past, which would still have been future for Daniel. And so we find already in Antiochus IV a fulfillment to this event we know as the abomination of desolation. However, and this is where it's important that we understand this, as we're going to see in this event, like I mentioned, we have a double fulfillment. Because it took place, it was fulfilled in the past, but it also is a reference to something greater, to something bigger that will take place in the future during the tribulation period. And so, in a very real way, Antiochus IV and what he did in 2nd century BC in Jerusalem at the temple is literally a picture or a type of what the Antichrist is going to do during the tribulation period. And so we see that connection. Antiochus IV is a type, is a picture of the Antichrist. And one day in the future, like Antiochus IV, during the tribulation period, and we actually believe during the middle point of the tribulation, the Antichrist is going to enter the temple in Jerusalem. So most definitely, the temple will be rebuilt. John is clear on that in Revelation chapter 11. And he's going to go to this sanctuary, and he's going to establish his image in the sanctuary. And we see that in Revelation chapter 13. And after the Antichrist establishes his image, he's literally going to force everyone to worship his image and to receive his mark either on their forehead or on their hand. And John actually tells us that those who don't receive the mark and those who don't worship his image, the image of Antichrist, are going to be killed. And so that is also the abomination of desolation. And so there is a double fulfillment. There is a past fulfillment that we see took place with Antiochus IV, but that was a picture, a type of something bigger that is still yet to come in the future during the tribulation period, in my opinion, with the Antichrist. And so we'll talk more about this event. Daniel describes it in detail, like I mentioned in Daniel chapter 8, and Daniel chapter 9, and also in Daniel chapter 11, that there's coming this abomination that makes desolation. And we will talk more about that in the future. Now notice seventh, the second coming of Christ. The second coming of Christ. Now this term is a reference to a future event when Jesus will return, and notice this, with his people to the earth, and he will return really to do two things: to judge his enemies, to crush all those who have risen up against him, and then after crushing his enemies, he will establish, in my opinion, and we'll talk about this more in a moment, his kingdom on the earth. Now notice with me there in your notes, it's important for you to understand that this event is distinct. This event is different from the rapture of the church. And not everybody would agree with me. Not everybody agrees with the timing and the nature of the rapture. But as I mentioned in the first part of the class, I hold to a pre-tribulation view of the rapture. And so I believe that there will be two parts to the coming of Christ. First, before the tribulation period, the Lord will come for his people, and we will meet him in the air, and then he will take us to heaven, really in fulfillment of John 14, to his Father's house. And so that's the first part, the rapture of the church. And then the second part of the coming of Christ, which we know as the second coming, will take place after the tribulation period. Really, the tribulation will end, according to Revelation 19, with the second coming of Christ. And during that event, Jesus will come with his people, and he will bring us to the earth. And so for the rapture, Jesus comes for his people. During the second coming, Jesus comes with his people, and he brings us to the earth, and in my opinion, he establishes his millennial kingdom. Now, in the future, we will talk more about this second coming, this appearance of Christ in glory and in power, because as we're going to see, Daniel actually speaks extensively on the coming of the Lord Jesus, what we would call the second coming. In Daniel chapter Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, Daniel actually describes it as the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. And he describes in detail the power and the glory that Messiah, the Son of Man, the Lord Jesus, will come with, and also the establishment of his kingdom upon the earth. At his second coming, Jesus will return, and he will judge his enemies. He will crush the kingdoms of this world, and then he will establish his kingdom upon the earth. And so we'll talk more about that, because Daniel speaks extensively on the day when the Son of Man will return, and also the kingdom that God will establish here on the earth. Now notice eighth, the millennium. The millennium, we also know this as the millennial kingdom. Now this term is a reference to a future event, in my opinion, when Jesus will establish his kingdom, the Messianic kingdom, upon the earth for 1,000 years. And so if you're thinking of the book of Revelation, and if you're thinking of a timeline, in chapters 6 through 18, we find a description of the tribulation period. After chapter 6 through 18, with chapter 19, we find the description of the return of Christ, the second coming of Christ, there in Revelation 19, 11 through 16. And then with chapter 20, in my opinion, it is my understanding, we find the description of the millennium kingdom, the millennial kingdom, the millennium. There in, I believe it's verses 1 through 10, John describes to us the kingdom that Jesus will establish for 1,000 years here on the earth after his second coming. And so Jesus comes for his people. He takes us to heaven. Then following, there is 7 years of tribulation here on the earth, 7 years of judgment, of God's wrath poured out on a Christ-rejecting world. Then that event ends with the second coming of Christ, and at his coming, Jesus then establishes his kingdom. Now, let's talk a little bit about this more for a moment, because notice with me, like the timing of the rapture, when it comes to the millennial kingdom, not everyone agrees concerning its nature, its character, concerning what it's all about. And so there's various views within Christianity, within evangelicals, concerning the millennium, concerning the millennial kingdom. And I want to share a few of them with you, the three main ones. First, there's a view we call premillennialism. And that simply states that Jesus will return in the future, and he will establish a literal, earthly, visible, 1,000-year kingdom upon the earth. And so this view just takes it literal, takes the text as it is there in Revelation 20, forgive me. And it just states that when Jesus returns, just like John tells us, he will establish 1,000-year kingdom here on earth. And so there is premillennialism, that it will be a literal, visible, earthly, 1,000-year kingdom one day, where Jesus establishes his throne in Jerusalem, and he is ruling and reigning over all the earth. And we as his people, we as the saints of God, we will rule and reign with him. Now, that's the view that I hold. That's the view that within the Calvary Chapel movement is held. In my opinion, that's the view that the Bible teaches. And so that is in my opinion, in my conviction, the correct view concerning the millennium. And it's typically the most popular view, although the last view that we're going to talk about is actually gaining a lot of popularity right now. And so I'll share with you in a moment a few reasons why I hold to a pre-millennial view of the kingdom. Now, the second view that is found is what we call post-millennialism. Now, notice with me, this view states that at this moment, the kingdom of Christ is being extended throughout the world through the preaching of the gospel. And eventually, a great multitude of the world is going to be converted. The world, slowly but surely, eventually is going to be what we would call Christianized. It will be converted through the preaching of the gospel. Now, as that takes place, this view states that the world is going to get better, that righteousness and peace is going to increase, and eventually this preaching of the gospel, this extension of the gospel of Christianity is going to usher in the return of Christ. And so eventually Christianity is going to be a dominant force in the world. And when that takes place, Jesus is going to return. And at his return, they would say, the world will immediately enter into the eternal order, what we know as the new heavens and the new earth and the new Jerusalem. And so this view, it goes from Revelation 19 and it skips 20 and it goes immediately into chapters 21 and 22. And so they do not hold to a future literal 1,000-year reign of Christ. To a certain degree, they believe that we're already in the millennial reign, that Jesus is reigning, which we would agree that Jesus is reigning at the right hand of his Father, but we would not agree with them that it's the same as he will reign during the millennial reign. But they would say that to a certain degree we're already in the millennial reign. Christianity is going to spread as it is spreading. Gospel is going to advance as it is advancing. But they would say things are going to get better. And I don't know if I would agree with that. It seems that things are not really getting better, but it seems like Paul tells us that in the last days, evil is increasing, and really the world, in my opinion, is marching forward to that day when the lawless one, the Antichrist, is going to come on the scene. And so I wouldn't agree with them that the world is getting better, but they say that the world is getting better, and eventually Christ will return. And when he returns, there's no millennium kingdom, there's no millennial reign, but immediately we enter into eternity, new heavens, new earth, the new Jerusalem. And so that's what we call post-millennialism. Now, there's not too many at this moment who hold to this view. It was a view that was very popular amongst the Puritans, and after them, there have been believers, professors, scholars, pastors who have held to this view. But right now, typically, it's rare to meet someone who holds to this view. Personally, none of my friends, none of my pastor friends or even professor friends hold to post-millennialism. And so it's not as popular as it once was. So that's post-millennialism. Now, third, there is a view called amillennialism. Amillennialism. And really, next to premillennialism, this third view is the most popular, well-known view held amongst believers. And basically, this is what amillennialism states. It states that, and this is just a summary, that when Jesus was exalted to the right hand of the Father after his resurrection and ascension, they would say that at that moment when all authority and power was given to him, the kingdom started. The kingdom started. The kingdom was initiated. And so they would say that right now we are in the millennium kingdom, the millennial kingdom. And the kingdom has started in a spiritual sense. And eventually, at some point in the future, Jesus is going to return to the earth. And when he returns, we're going to immediately enter into the eternal order, the new heavens, the new earth, and the new Jerusalem. And so, like post-millennialism, they do not believe in a future, literal, 1,000-year reign of Christ here on the earth. There's no future millennial kingdom, but they would say that presently we are in the kingdom, that Jesus is ruling and reigning, and that all that is left is the return of Christ and the eternal order. And so that's the idea behind millennialism, no millennial kingdom. But to be honest, the name probably should be realized millennial kingdom, realized millennialism, because they would say that the kingdom has already been realized, that we presently are already in the millennial kingdom. And we would say, I would respond, and we'll talk more about this in a second, that yes, Jesus is ruling and reigning. Yes, in a spiritual sense, he is establishing his kingdom in the hearts of all those who have repented and placed their faith and trust in him. Yes, all authority has been given to Jesus. He is sovereign. But the scriptures seem to indicate that one day that will be fully actualized, fully manifested during a earthly 1,000-year reign here on earth. And so in my opinion, I do not agree with millennialism. I do not agree with post-millennialism, but most definitely I hold to a pre-millennialistic view of the kingdom, that Jesus is ruling and reigning at the moment, but when he returns, he will set up 1,000-year earthly, visible, literal kingdom here on the earth. Now, quickly, let me mention a few reasons why I believe that is the case in the correct view of the millennium. First, notice the promises of God. The promises of God. Now, unfortunately, we don't have too much time to get into this, but I just want to give you just an introduction to some of the reasons why I believe premillennialism is true. Now, if you would ever want a little more in-depth, if you ever want a little more detailed information, there's a lot of good resources, whether through books, lectures, videos, that you can investigate and study more. Just off the top of my head, you can go to YouTube, and under YouTube, you can go to Desiring God Ministries, which is the ministry of John Piper. And years ago, John Piper recorded a lecture or a discussion called A Night of Eschatology. And literally what he does is he sits in a table and he brings together 3 scholars, and each scholar holds to a different view of the millennial kingdom. And so he had one scholar who believes in post-millennialism. He had another scholar who believes in amillennialism. And then he had another scholar who believes in pre-millennialism. And literally for 2 hours, they're just having this discussion on what they believe and why they believe it. It's a great discussion, a great resource just to kind of understand the various views and the various reasons and arguments for the views. And I would highly recommend it. I'm actually representing the pre-millennialism view. He had James Hamilton, who is a professor at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Great scholar, amazing scholar, and he does a great job representing the pre-millennialistic view concerning the kingdom. Representing the amillennialism, he had Sam Storms. And I think representing the post-millennialism, he had Doug Wilson. And so it's a great resource. I would encourage you to look into it. Another resource just off the top of my head is on YouTube, the John Ankerberg Show. Just Google it, just search it there on YouTube. And he actually interviews Dr. Norman Geisler. I think it's about a 4-part interview. And Dr. Geisler just brings amazing, solid evidence for a pre-millennium view of the kingdom. Great resource. I would encourage you to look into it. But here is just an overview of why I hold to this view. First, the promises of God. This is all we mean. There are promises, covenants that God made in the Old Testament with his people that are unconditional and that have not been fulfilled yet. And so they are still waiting to be fulfilled. And I believe, and many believe, that these promises, these covenants have to be fulfilled during the millennial kingdom, that there has to be an earthly kingdom with Messiah ruling and reigning in order for these promises to be fulfilled. And so you have the Abrahamic covenant, you have the Davidic covenant, and you have the new covenant pertaining to the nation of Israel specifically, that still, it would seem, are awaiting a full fulfillment. They have not been fulfilled totally, entirely yet. And so a millennium kingdom is necessary for these covenants to be fulfilled in their entirety. I'll just give you a quick example. God promised Abraham land. God promised to give Abraham really the whole land of Canaan. God even gives him the dimensions starting at the river of Egypt all the way to the Euphrates River. And yet we see that never in his life did Abraham own that land. Never, even in the history of Israel, did they own and possess the land that God promised Abraham. And so we believe that's an unconditional promise. That's an unconditional covenant. And so it needs to be fulfilled. That one day, Abraham and his descendants need to possess the land that God promised him. And so that demands, in my opinion, a millennial kingdom. Now notice second, the book of Revelation. In my opinion, the book of Revelation is a solid argument for premillennialism, because a simple, literal, natural reading of the book of Revelation requires a future, literal, millennial kingdom. Those who deny the millennial, really what they do is they read the text, and instead of reading it in a literal way, in a simple, natural, literal way, they spiritualize the text. They allegorize the text, and that's why they don't believe in a millennial kingdom. So when John says that there's going to be 1,000-year reign, we should understand that in a literal way. 1,000-year reign. When John tells us that Satan is going to be chained up for 1,000 years, we should understand that in a literal 1,000-year way. Because there's nothing in the text to make us think otherwise. If we just take it for face value, simple, literal, natural reading, the conclusion is there will be a millennial kingdom. And then third, church history. Now, some would argue with me on this, but as you study church history, you see that the premillennial view of the kingdom, that there would be a future 1,000-year reign of Christ here on the earth, that was actually the earliest view of the church. As we study church history, as we look to church history, we find that the first few hundred years, the majority of the church fathers and leaders believed in a future, literal, 1,000-year reign of Christ. That didn't change until roughly the time of Augustine. Augustine was an amillennialist. He did not believe in premillennialism and a future 1,000-year reign. And then with Augustine, approximately 400 AD, then we begin to see a change where the majority begin to hold to an amillennialist view. But before Augustine, the first couple hundred years, we see that the majority of the early church fathers were premillennialists. And so those are some arguments for a premillennialistic view of the kingdom. Ninth, notice, let's continue. We'll finish with these last 2 points. Notice the great white throne judgment. Now, this term is a reference to the final judgment that will take place after the return of Christ, and in my opinion, after the millennial kingdom. This is Revelation 20:11 through, I believe, 18. And really what's going to happen, John tells us that after the millennial kingdom and after the second coming of Christ, all non-believers will be raised from the dead. They'll stand before God Almighty. The books will be opened. The book of life will be opened. And those whose name are not found in the book of life, they will be judged, they will be condemned, and they will be thrown into the lake of fire. And there they will be eternally separated from God. Interestingly, according to Jesus in John 5, he actually will be the one doing the judging on that last day. All judgment has been given to the Son, and the very one who is being rejected now will be the one who will be doing the judging on that last day. And then notice 10th, and this is really Revelation 21 and 22, the last 2 chapters of the Bible. This is what we call the eternal order. You probably know it as the new heavens and the new earth and the new Jerusalem. And really what John tells us is after the millennium, after the great white throne judgment, after evil is quarantined and separated from the presence of God forever, God is going to do something new. And really, John just describes to us all that God is going to do and all that's awaiting for us for all of eternity. We're going to be with God. We're going to be with Christ. And we are going to dwell forever with Him in the new Jerusalem on a new earth that God is going to create. And that is a summary, a little introduction of some of the main terms and some of the main events when it comes to eschatology. And like I mentioned, as we start the book of Daniel and as we study this amazing prophetic book, Daniel is going to talk about a lot of these events. He's going to mention them, and he's going to really lay that foundation that the New Testament, specifically the book of Revelation, is going to build upon. And so, God bless you, fam. That is the end of the second part of the lecture. Hope and pray that you guys enjoyed that as much as I did. Grace and peace, fam. Make sure, if you have not already, email me, introduce yourself, if you're able to, and start reading the Tozer book. I think this week we said it's chapters 3 and 4, And also start thinking of a topic, a theme for your Daniel paper. I know that it's not due until a while, but the sooner you get started on it, the sooner you start gathering resources on it, the easier it's going to be. And so grace and peace, fam. God bless you. And I hope you guys have an awesome weekend, an awesome week next week. And I will see you next Friday. Grace and peace. God bless you. We are dismissed.